Hello, my name is Marcus Warner, and today I'm going to be sharing 5 tips on how to speed up your creative workflow when writing epic orchestral music. I'd just like to preface this video by saying that it kind of goes under the assumption that you already have some knowledge with working with Logic and also writing for orchestral instruments. If there's anything that I'm talking about and you're not entirely sure what it is, you can drop a comment or search up for some tutorials on YouTube because there's already plenty out there. It's just this specific video I'm making because I feel it's something that's not really been covered yet, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Today I'm just going to be using Logic's inbuilt plugins because in that way I think it's a level playing field for everybody and it makes the most sense to demonstrate on. Tip number 1. Have a template. I have 3 templates depending on what kind of work I'm doing. The first one is for larger symphonic work, the second one is more of a chamber-sized orchestra, and then the third one is a piano track and 6 buses for strings, brass, percussion, woodwinds. So what I can do is I can play around with ideas on the piano. If I really like something, then I can start building it up. For the purposes of today's tutorial, we're going to be doing a large symphonic template. So I'm going to do all of that in Logic. Okay, so there we are. We have a rudimental orchestral template and it only took me 8 seconds to make. That wasn't funny. We're going to add to this more as we progress, but I would say that the following: brass, percussion, strings. If you're looking at a really basic level, that is what epic music starts with. These here are summing stacks. They're essentially a bus, but what they are is a handy little folder that lets you organise everything a little bit more clearly, and you can actually add stuff to the bus simply by dragging it into that folder, which is so handy and speeds up the workflow so much. Right click on the instrument's name, create track stack, and then from there summing stack. And there we have a shiny new auxiliary channel ready to go with the instrument underneath it, and then you click and drag more instruments underneath it, and that helps keep your project so much more organised. Tip number 2, we're going to start with a hook. The first thing the audience is going to hear is your hook, and so that's so important to get that right, and something that's going to engage the audience and make them want to keep listening straight away. And it can be something unique to you, or if you're on a time crunch and someone's asked for some background music that's just generic, you could probably go for something simple that's just strings. What I'm going to be doing next is reinforcing those strings with an extra shaker, which helps give the rhythm a little bit more punch, makes the strings sound a little bit tighter, and just all round sounds a little bit more interesting. Okay, so we have an instrumental hook, and from there we can kind of use that throughout the entire piece of music, and as long as we're careful and don't make it too in your face, we can kind of get away with that being all the way through the music. Tip number 3 is a strong melody, and I think this is pretty obvious, but if you listen to 90% of the greats, any of those epic music artists, there's always a main theme. So if someone wants some epic background music, you could afford to perhaps be a little bit more subtle with the main theme and have less notes and less interest going on. But if you're writing something for yourself, in my opinion, main theme is a must. So we're going to go over to the piano and I'm going to come up with something really quickly. And what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to make a piano track in order to record this. I like to roll off the top end to make it sound a bit like a felt piano, and also take out some of these mids here. Certainly not perfect, but it helps get me ideas down on paper, or, well, metaphorical paper. What I'm going to do then is turn this melody that I've created into an actual tangible chorus. Tip number 4 is using the following method for writing for strings and then brass. What I do is I start from the ground with the basses and then work my way up using a sort of copy and paste method, which is really, I'm not going to say stinky, but it's not the best way of writing for orchestras. However, it does get the job done very quickly if you're on a time crunch. I'm just having a go here with Logic strings, which I haven't done in ages, and I'm reminded why people hate them so much. But there's a few tips for writing for strings which make them kind of sound epic and quite full and dynamic. Bass line first in the basses, copy that up an octave in the cellos, and then the third an octave above that in the violas. And then that gives us this sound. I've added a little bit of spice to the basses by making them do staccato crotchets on the beat. Just make the release a tiny bit longer because I feel like they're getting cut off too abruptly. You can hear that the actual volume is going up and down, and that is because I simply programmed in some expression data. And if I open up here, the MIDI draw tab, some basic sculpting going on using a slider down here. You can also program this in manually just using the pen tool. I tend to try and do it by hand because then it sounds a tiny bit more natural, a little bit more human. Command 3 to open up our MIDI transform window here. Go down to this tab that says humanize, and essentially what it's doing, it's adding or subtracting a random amount of MIDI data. Here you've got the note position, here you've got the velocity, and here you've got the note length. I tend to leave it all on 10, but if I click select and operate, we have ever so slight variations in velocity, which in Logic just means that some notes will be a little bit quieter than others, some will be a little bit louder. If you're using more expensive VSTs, that might trigger different samples, or different round robins, or different legato speeds. The difference with the brass is, of course, that they require room to breathe. I've actually used the staccato basses and taken out a note every bar to allow the tuba to breathe. I've done the tuba and the trombones and been kind of cheeky and copied and pasted the sections up from here. So I'm going to go on now and do the melody in the horns. I don't even think this is worth being a tip because it's just the way epic music is. One thing I should point out, which I've kind of forgotten to mention, is that I didn't really plan this out in advance, and I'm discovering things as I go about Logic's inbuilt instruments that I am actually going to address. Firstly, these horns. I'm not going to say they're great. Bring up this fundamental down at the bottom. Like that much. Like no kidding. Like seriously, like get that. It gets away less of that trebly pop brassy sound and gets in more of that mellow, dramatic, orchestral sound. Now, I'm fairly certain in this section there's probably 4 horns playing. So if I do another melody line on the same track, that essentially means we're now listening to 8 horns, which is kind of what we want. In epic music, 8 horns is like a good number of horns. Big open fifths and fourths, it makes quite a grand sound, and also it gives a bit more beef to those Logic samples just to get them sounding a little bit better. It's quite difficult to play the main melody all the way through at this tempo and still have room to breathe because it's quite a fast melody. So what I've done is for half of the phrase, the French horns play the main melody, and then the trumpets take over for the second half of the phrase. Notice here how the trumpets don't start too high above the horns, they kind of dovetail into each other, which gets the melody sounding like it's one whole part rather than 2 separate sections. Sounding acceptable, I think, I hope. Sorry, I meant to be doing a tutorial. This is acceptable, guys. To add some variation, I'm going to add in legato violins 1 and 2. I can keep these staccato ones going because in big epic music it's kind of okay to divizzi up the sections, which means divide each section into 2 halves. Not quite as rich as when you've got the full section playing everything, but if you're using a MIDI orchestra, well, the sky's the limit, and so I recommend trying this wherever possible. Violins 1 right at the top, and then an octave below them violins 2, then an octave below them the horns, and potentially the trumpets, depending on how high we're going. We don't need breathing spaces anymore, so the easiest way to get rid of these is to use force legato, which is here under edit, trim, and then note end to selected notes. You can see here I've actually set up that little key to be the key command for this because I use it so often and I highly recommend doing it. I'm going to do a whole separate video about key commands because I think they're so integral to speeding up your workflow in Logic. These long notes in the strings would be played with a bow movement, and so for that I'm going to actually use the expression fader just to add a little bit more dynamic. My god, is this chair annoying and squeaky? It's a bit debatable, but with the horns you can get away without using the expression. Trombones I use it to go up and down a little bit, but for the strings I always use it. So as if this tutorial wasn't already janky enough, my camera which I've got set up is overheating, probably because the weather outside is so hot. So I've switched to my backup camera, but here we have 2 sections now. What I've done is I've had violin 2 playing an octave above the horns and then an octave below the trumpets. My violin section 2 plays 2 octaves above the horns and then 1 octave above the trumpets. So it's really all the way up there at the top of what the string players can do, which gives us a big fat octave. I might also add in more instruments in this second section, such as a choir, or something just to add a little bit more variety. I feel like it's ever so slightly too repetitive at the moment. We could change that up by doing variation in timbre and sort of eking out a few more differences in tone. So we've done the main part of the orchestration, which is the melody and the harmony, which leads me now on to tip number 5, which is good percussion. Interesting percussion that uses syncopation, a variety of tracks, panning all over the place to give a sense of scale and depth. I'm just going to make a quick percussion line in a short period of time and then go through some techniques that you can use to really make a good sounding rhythm that stands out even if you've got limited VSTs. Finishing with the timpani, which is obviously an extremely important part of any epic piece of music. Logic inbuilt one, I believe. We have that is the standard hit, and if I move the modulation wheel, we got our roll. Okay, great. What I've got here is taiko drums to give it a little bit more lower end beef. The inbuilt toms on headbanger kit, and what I've done to make this sound a bit more orchestral and epic is tuned it down by a lot, and then added a bit more of an attack time, plus a load of reverb. And then after that, we have a higher tom, which is almost acting like a snare. Cymbals, lots and lots of cymbals. 2 sets of what I would say were higher pitched toms. They provide some fill, and then an African kit, which is djembe. These together create counter rhythms which fill in the gaps between the toms and the cymbals, creating quite a thick sound. We then have hi-hats and a couple of extra claps filling in the gaps there, as well as my shaker from earlier. Add that in with the timpani and we have ourselves a nice fat percussion sound. I'm going to copy and paste this percussion line as we have it so far, and then from there we'll see how it sounds with everything else together. Okay, so there we have it. As I look at the timer now, this took from the start of recording about 2.5 hours. So I would say in about 2 hours, you could create something that is, I'm not going to say it's brilliant, but it's a respectable piece of music that will get you started if you're on a time crunch and you need to get some epic background music done in a hurry. I'll be honest, I've done an absolutely appalling job of mixing. This is terribly mixed. Do not use this as a reference for mixing. However, in terms of orchestration technique and writing things quickly, hopefully these 5 tips helped you. Tip 1, start with a template so you can get straight into writing. Tip 2, create an instrumental hook, or any hook really, that grabs the audience's attention from the get-go and is part of the piece's identity. Tip 3, give the piece a nice strong melody which is its real driving force. Tip 4, start from the bottom with the basses, work your way up through the strings, copy and paste where appropriate. Tip 5, the final tip, make sure you have a good percussion line. And when people are listening on headphones, you can hear the little nuances that you've put into that piece. So it really does make a difference. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. This was my first proper tutorial from start to finish on writing in Logic. I'm considering doing more of these in the future. So if that's something you'd like to see, please let me know by leaving a comment. And if you haven't already, a subscribe button I think is on the right, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.